UNLV Microcertificate Economics. Now we need to talk about some potential problems with capitalism. Our buddy Adam Smith talked to us about what it takes for markets to work correctly. And there's two most important things. 250 years later, we still think those are the most important things. We just have refined how we think about them. The first of these is competition. Unless there's competition, the businesses don't have any reason to give you a good deal, give you good service, all of that invisible hand stuff. And there has to be a lot of consumers for the businesses. If the business has a very limited selection of consumers, then the business isn't going to operate right. So we need there to be large numbers of buyers and large numbers of sellers for the market to come together and find the right price. Part B of this is information. As a consumer, I need to know what I'm going to buy. And the classic example of this is used cars. Consumers get ripped off buying used cars all the time, pay too much, get something they didn't want because they didn't know what the characteristics of that vehicle were. We have to know. Information is critical. It's one of the reasons our healthcare system is the way it is you don't know what you're going to get charged. You don't know if there is some hospital that's better, cheaper. You just don't know because there's no way to gather that information. Unless the buyers have really good information and understand what's going on, we're not going to get the right price in the market. And consumers are going to make mistakes that are going to prevent them from achieving their happiness. Number one, does capitalism naturally create inequality? Capitalism is built on incentives. It's built with the idea that the people who work harder do better. And the people who create and come up with new ideas and are innovative and creative get paid more. On the other hand, there's also a belief among some people that the people who have more find it easier to continue to get more, so that over time the rich get richer and the poor might get better off too, but the rich are going to get richer faster than the poor. And we'll talk about that and see if some of those things are really true. Does competition erode naturally over time? In the 1800s, we went fairly quickly from there being competition to there being almost no competition in a lot of industries. Not just a few industries, but a lot of industries. During the Progressive Era, we passed antitrust legislation. We broke those companies up. We started a whole bunch of programs to create competition. But if we look around the world today, we think of companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google. There's a small number of companies that are very important in our lives. Amazon. Is it a defect of capitalism, or is this a change and capitalism is becoming something new and different in the information age? Something to think about. There's an internal conflict, obviously, that should be, again, clear to you, that workers want higher wages and businesses want to pay you lower wages. How that all transpires and what that is and how that relationship works is something we need to talk about. But the critics of capitalism contend that over time businesses win this fight and that workers' wages don't keep up. And in fact, since 1980 in the United States, people who work by the hour have barely kept up with inflation, and they're basically making the same money they were making 30 years ago. In the late 1800s, we had a bunch of people who were called the robber barons. Some of the more famous ones are up here: J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt. After the Civil War, Johnson's the president and then Grant's the president, We then get a series of American presidents who are one-term presidents and aren't remembered for much, except that more or less they're kind of in the pockets of these guys. The railroad workers go out on strike because there's bad pay and bad working conditions and all this other stuff, and the robber barons appeal to the president, who sends the army in to do not nice things to the railroad workers. The U.S. government actively fights against labor unions and attempts by workers to engage themselves in the capitalist enterprise and sort of sells out to the robber barons. It leads to the progressive era, and we'll talk about that in a second, but some very interesting views of the world, right? J.P. Morgan and Carnegie and Vanderbilt, these guys control huge sectors of the American economy. Some of the things that work counter to this, one of those historically has always been unions. When workers unionize and they band together, they can then negotiate much more effectively with the company that they're working for. It's a more even relationship, which is why big-time capitalists are often anti-union. Henry Ford paid his workers extra money to keep them from joining the union. If you've never read The Grapes of Wrath, you should go read the book The Grapes of Wrath. We also had the progressive movement in the United States, the late 1800s through the Great Depression. There were tons of laws passed during the progressive era to make, that was era, not area, to make workers' lives better, to make it harder for the government to intervene between the union and the company, to make the company have to deal with the union instead of being able to get the army to come in and beat up the workers. So many laws to help unions wage minimum wages and maximum hours you have to work. Teddy Roosevelt was probably the only truly progressive who was president. He had something called the Square Deal, where he talked about the need to have fairness for everybody, fairness for companies, and fairness for workers, and fairness for consumers, and fairness for everybody. He broke up Standard Oil, got rid of a lot of the monopolies and trusts that existed, yelled and screamed at businesses that were doing things that he didn't think were appropriate, created the Food and Drug Administration to make sure that the food being sold was good and healthy, started national parks. He also went out, I put that little flag there and a little picture of the Panama Canal. He also went down and sent the army down to steal Panama from Colombia and build a canal, which we took over, and we also kind of took over the Philippines. If you've never read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, Roosevelt read that book, and based on that and what he read in that book and how the meatpacking industry worked and some of these other things worked, he started this FDA and regulation of food and drug. This tops out during the Great Depression, and then after the Depression, the country kind of turns the other way with regard to labor. But again, we'll talk about that more. This guy we're going to talk about here, what Karl Marx is going to yell about is that there's unequal power relationships in capitalism, that the capitalists have power essentially to exploit the workers, and that there's decision making by the few. And we'll talk about that and his view of that here in a second.